Today we're going to talk about this idea of potential fantasy. It came up today in our Culture Creators, as you mentioned, and Lauren, who is our producer, actually brought up just the question. And it was about, like, we talked about this idea today about cognitive distortion, how a lot of times we don't want to limit things, in our lives. And, as an organization, cognitive distortion is that organizations many times can react based off of what they think is going to happen, assumptions, people's anxieties, and they build these false worlds or false narratives that many times you just build a culture around. But one of the questions that were brought in was the idea of when you start shutting doors, right? The idea of potential. And, so Lauren brings it up, and then it led to Michelle even talking about how that was one of her things, the idea of potential. And she made the statement, you can hide under potential, but she didn't want the pressure of actual production. And that's something I've thought about because I think, years ago, I was sitting at a football practice, Florida State football practice. And at that current time, he was an offensive coordinator, Jimbo Fisher, who went on to be Florida State's head coach, won a national championship, and also go to Texas A&M. And Jimbo was he's offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach. And he had one of his players out there, I won't mention the guy's name, really talented, but he was like the backup. And everybody saw his potential. The crowd, the fans saw his potential. Everybody wanted him. They knew, man, once this guy steps in the field, he's going to be amazing. And I'm sitting there at practice, and they're going through certain drills. And all of a sudden, Jimbo just loses on him. And he makes a statement, and it's always stuck with me. He says that, he's like, son, you don't want to be the guy. You want to be the guy who should be the guy, but you never will be the guy. And what he was meaning by that was that you want to you want everyone to think how good you can be, but you don't want to do what it takes to be that good. You want to always have that kind of fantasy of your potential, but not produce. You see in certain companies, they see somebody's potential. But the truth is that potential is fine and potential is great. But potential is not a predictor of what you're going to do. It's the idea of production. And so I think a lot of times, especially in the generations that we're living in, I think a lot of times people can hide under potential and live in a fantasy that their actual potential is production. But actually it's not, because of the willingness, not wanting to feel the pain of what it means to actually have to take that potential and bring it to real life.
What do you think drives the falling in love with potential?
I think it's the feeling, it's the ideating, it's the dreams. I think we love the fact to be able to think about what we could be.
What does, falling in love with the idea of possibility versus putting in the application of trying to get somewhere?
Yep.
What does doing that produce in a person long term?
I think, first of all, what it actually produces resilience in someone. They actually learn how to push toward a goal. They learn, I think also you learn wisdom in that process because you learn what works, what doesn't work. I think what you also learn, you get to learn what you're good at, what you're not. You get to learn what your potential cap is, what it's not. Going back to when I was talking about basketball as a player, I got to a place where I worked really hard, pushed myself, but there became a cap where I realized and again, some of that stuff happens, injuries happen, whatever, but I hit a cap where I'm like, okay, I'm probably not going to be an NBA, again, once I got hurt, I wasn't going to be an NBA draft pick. So I had to settle with there's a cap to where I was at that time. I think when you do that, that's a good thing. It's a good thing to know where your limits are, and it allows you, because now you're able to say, man, do I want to keep working and this is probably what I'm going to produce, or do I want to go try to do something different? And so I think you get to see really what's inside of you. And I think so many times people are so afraid of what their work's going to reveal about them.
How do you think this shows up? This, maybe controversial question. I'm curious. How do you think this shows up in women? How do you think this shows up in men?
It's a great question. I'll start now. I'll start with men. And here's what I would say. I think in today's world, I think we've absolutely crushed, especially young men, to actually producing things. I think any young man you see with a passion, a desire, or whatever, and even beyond that, we kind of have killed that. We've killed the ambition inside of people. Also, we've killed because we haven't held young men accountable for production either. You know what I mean? That's why I always, I've talked about this many times. That's why I actually believe going to work matters. I don't believe in, again, companies can have the work from home policy, whatever, but I actually believe that it is going to hinder leadership, especially leadership of young men. There's something about having to get up, put pants on, a shirt, drive yourself to work. You can't go out all night the night before on Tuesday and smoke and then show up at 8 a.m. to your meeting versus now at the crib, you can just roll over, put a shirt on and just hop on Zoom. I think that's going to hinder it. I think we're not holding men accountable to production. And so I think that has been, I think we're seeing a lack of production in men. I think I would throw it back to you when it comes to this idea with women. As a female who actually is out there, working, producing, things like that, how do you actually feel this shows up, for women now?
I don't know. The question kind of came to me on the fly, so I would need to think about it deeper.
Okay, how does this show up? So let me ask you this question. When we talk about this idea of potential fantasy, whatever, somebody who has you have an immense amount of talent, let's say this, how do you actually bring it? How do you not stay in a fantasy world of your potential and actually have brought it to real life?
I will say that, when you first asked me the questions, one of the first things that came to my mind, unfiltered and not, super critically thought through, that I'll say is there is kind of a level that, especially romantically, who you are with romantically and historically for women has determined your access, has determined your level of safety. And so there is almost a level of hoping for unlimited potential and looking for kind of the next best thing because it practically determined what you'd have for the rest of your life. Yeah. Which I think is interesting to consider, interesting to think of and kind of follow the thread down. Yeah. And I think because growing up, I've definitely had experiences that are unique to being female. And at the same time, I didn't grow up in a home my immediate family where I was communicated that my opportunities will be different because I am female. So I also don't, my starting point isn't that I will have different opportunities because I'm a woman. Yeah. Whether that's true or not, society-wise, I think my emotional starting point isn't that necessarily. And so because of that, I haven't overly considered that as a factor in terms of how do I navigate discipline and also fantasy or opening my options. If anything, I focus a lot more on age. That brings me a lot more of that starts to feel that boxes me in more. That starts to feel that impacts opportunities more. And it also heightens the idea of I have less time. So what do I know about myself enough right now? And what I experience is going to reveal more about me. And you always hear the importance in your youth to explore all of your possibilities, but it's that's not what I've done in my youth. That has not at all been what I've done in my youth. So if anything, that's the thing that might bring me anxiety or fear that makes me want to sit in a place and not build towards something because I'm there would be a benefit to just dabbling in this thing here, dabbling in this thing there that would relate enough to my skill sets to where I would be able to produce enough, I would be, smart enough or creative enough to be able to make money, things like that, without having something that tied to maybe a long-term vision, just for the sake of getting to understand who I am more and what I like more. And it would totally be justified. Now, why haven't I done that? I haven't done that because I also am so compelled by long-term vision. And if I can't see how what I'm doing right now ties to a long-term vision, I will not do it.
What you've done is, and I agree with people when they say, hey, go out there, make mistakes, do these things, and try stuff, right? I agree with that. I think the other thing that we're not talking about is that another thing you should learn in your 20s is how to produce something. It's how to actually learn how to work and fight through things you don't like or whatever to actually produce something, because that builds a grit, a resilience, so that when you actually are, maybe you're trying different things and you find this kind of role and niche or whatever, you have the skill set. Because just because you're passionate about something doesn't mean you're going to produce something. I think that's one of the biggest lies, where, well, I have passion, so if I have passion about it, I'm going to produce stuff. I mean, I am passionate about communicating, whether if it is communicating leadership talks or preaching the Bible, right? But there are times it is a grind. You know what I mean? It took me, when I first started learning how to preach the Bible, for example, I would literally spend 30 to 40 hours a week, like getting every week to learn how to communicate, to studying, to doing this, to running it over and over again. Dude, that was torturous at times for something I love to do. But I learned that muscle.
Yeah, and, I've also am kind of growing up and also becoming educated in a place where I can trust that I will find myself within it. And those environments don't always exist. I think part of why we exist is because we believe that those environments should exist. Like that's what the spaces that we believe leaders should create for people. But I have the luxury of growing in an environment where I know that whatever interests like arise throughout here, I will also be entrusted to do things like a passion project here and a passion project there. So I don't feel like I'm losing something long term. And then the other thing I will say is that oddly enough, I feel very comfortable in changing my mind. Like if I try to do something that's risky, and then I feel like, oh, I shouldn't do that, or I shouldn't have done that, or I'm about to do this and I don't feel like I should do it, I'm comfortable with changing my mind. And sometimes it feels like if you make this commitment to this thing, like you're going to have to like see it like till the end, which can be true and can be important for people depending on what extreme you fall. But I feel like I was 18, 19, like looking back, I'm like, oh, I was taking pretty major risks without a safety net. Yeah. Like 100%. I was 19 moving in with a family who I did not know. Yeah. My parents didn't. Like, nobody knew them. Yep. Like, I was, at the same time, like, deciding that I wasn't going to go to school anymore. Yep. I was, at the time, making $300 a month. Yeah. I don't have a family who supports me, like, financially. Working at, man, shout out to Harley Davidson, right? Yeah. So, and I think that has shaped it a lot, too, and what helps me know that I can change my mind, and that I also don't have to prove to myself that I can take risk. There's good parts of healthy fear. Like, let me tell you this. Healthy fear kept me out of trouble. I had a 6'6" dad. Like, he was a big dude. Healthy fear of like having to go home, like if I decide to go get high or something like that, I'm like, I'm not going home to him like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, dude, like no shot. So fear of seeing some trouble at times my brother got himself into kept me out of trouble. I think a lot of times today, in order to go into what you're saying, to produce something, you've got to have this healthy sense of fear. Cause it's like, seeing the movie Inside Out, like anxiety was seen as this like negative, but when you watch it, like there's moments when anxiety, like the energy of it, not so much the looping that anxiety does, or not, but the actual energy of anxiety actually will be a thing that pushes you to produce something. If you channel it. And I think we've been so pushed not to want to feel that we're losing and we're lacking production. That's my encouragement to everyone who's listening. Like, listen, go out there, be willing to take a risk, be willing to go produce something. Let your work, here's the thing, let your work tell you how good you are. Like, let your work tell you how good you are. And that's okay. Like, you may not produce the greatest painting in the world. You may not produce the greatest video in the world. You may not, have the largest business. But what it will do is help you have more and more understanding of actually who you are. And I think in that process, man, you become more and more aware. I think even producing stuff helps you become more authentic because you get to see more and more actually of how you've been hardwired to be.
All right, guys. Well, hey, we appreciate that. And my encouragement to you is this, is to simply just to go in and start putting some work into the earth. You know, I know that it can be hard. I know it can be difficult. I know those feelings, those emotions are hard to deal with, but fight through it. There is another side to it. And when you get to the other side, you get a better understanding of actually who you are. You become more of an authentic leader when you actually are out there producing things. Until next time, keep writing the rules.